So in this video, I want to discuss how the traditional neoclassical and Keynesian perspectives about the macroeconomy are embedded in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. In other words, to show how this model is kind of apolitical and could support either branch of economic, either perspective on the economy, support their perspectives. So I think this is important so that your normative beliefs about which story, which narrative better describes the economy doesn't interfere with your objective predictions based on a simple standard workhorse model of the macroeconomy. And also so that your normative beliefs don't interfere with your objective prescriptions, that based on the model, if they're based on the model and your understanding of the model, if there is a particular set of policy tools which are meant to get the economy operating at a more desirable equilibrium, you don't let your political affiliations in any way dictate what the optimal policy would be. And I think it's also important that you just understand how this model incorporates both of these perspectives, and that'll be something that is assessed for understanding in this class. So we've discussed Say's law a couple of times already in this class, named after economist Jean-Baptiste Say. And now I guess it's important to officially and formally state what Say's law is, which is that supply creates its own demand. And we can contrast that with what the book dubs as Keynes' law, which is demand creates its own supply. However, it's important to note here, both of these are gross simplifications, both of which were never said directly. Keynes's law wasn't even anything associated with Keynes really in his lifetime. It's kind of a useful foil for understanding the other side of Say's law. And both of these are obviously incapable of always holding. So it goes without saying that just if a specific good is produced, it's not necessarily going to be bought. But Say's law is saying that by producing something, we're creating the means for which it can be purchased. However, we know from experience that that doesn't hold either, that just because someone is paid for their services, which were needed to produce a good, doesn't mean that they're going to spend all that money. First of all, there may be layoffs, which are due to sticky wages. And second of all, there may be leakages in savings, which could then be translated into investment. However, that's not going to be happening if we are facing a zero lower bound or a liquidity constraint, or if there are such expectations which are going to cause business investment to decrease as well. So on the other hand, it's equally as ludicrous to say just because there is greater spending in the economy doesn't mean that, or it's ludicrous to say that just because they're spending in the economy means that producers are going to decide to invest more, take more chances, invest more of their resources in producing more goods if they don't think that that consumption is going to be stable and long lasting. And so that being said, we can look at both of these, the validity or the requirements that would be needed for both of these perspectives to hold in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. So it's important to note that in the Keynesian law and the Keynesian framework of the macroeconomy, that if we simply increase aggregate demand, then aggregate supply should increase as well. We should remain in equilibrium, and it should increase our economic output, increase our real GDP without coming at a cost of significant inflation. And importantly, we can see that in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework when we're in this area of the short run aggregate supply curve where the curve isn't increasing steeply, where we don't see significant increases in price that are associated with increases in real output. On the other hand, the neoclassical perspective is that because supply creates its own demand, if we increase aggregate demand externally, it's largely going to be redundant, that it's not going to lead to much economic growth, but it is going to lead to higher prices. And we can see that up here in this neoclassical zone, where if we were to increase aggregate demand, so ADN2, then we are only increasing output by a little bit, but we're increasing prices significantly. And so really both of the Keynes law and Say's law, you want to think of those in terms of what they imply about the effectiveness of increases in aggregate demands as a way to inspire economic growth. So embedded in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model from the Keynesian perspective is a downward sloping Phillips curve. And so the Phillips curve posits a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, that basically we have a choice between the two, or a balance between the two if we choose that path. But the higher that inflation gets, the lower the unemployment rate gets. And conversely, the lower the inflation rate, the more unemployment. And we've discussed this at other points in time in this class, that developed economies often face this choice with the institutions that they put in place, developed capitalist economies, that some more social democratic economies of Western Europe and Scandinavia choose to have perhaps higher levels of inflation and less unemployment. And in the US, we choose perhaps more unemployment as a way to keep inflation low. And so we see that negative relationship here in the Phillips curve, and we can also see that when we have higher prices in the aggregates demand framework here, that when we have higher prices due to increases in aggregate demand, that we are also seeing economic expansion, which is going to drive unemployment down. And so that's part of the neoclassical, the Keynesian understanding of unemployment and inflation in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. Neoclassicists, on the other hand, have a different perspective on the relationship between unemployment and inflation in the economy. They feel as if, stereotypical here, but in general, neoclassicists feel as if there's not a choice between unemployment and inflation. There's a choice between more inflation and less inflation. And so part of this is because of, I guess, their perspective on where the short-run aggregate supply curve is in relation to the long-run aggregate supply curve, or at least a fear of where it may be. And as part of the way in which we can show how a increase in our short-run equilibrium may be unsustainable, we've got this example where aggregate demand increases from 80 knot to 81, which, when holding short-run aggregate supply constant, leads to an increase in our real level of output. However, the example thrown out in the textbook for why this may be unsustainable is that when we increase our real output from Y naught to Y1, then we're not only increasing GDP, but we're decreasing unemployment. And importantly, we're decreasing unemployment past the point of the full employment GDP, which means that in this framework, that we may have an unsustainably low level of unemployment, which would mean that, similar to that dot-com late 90s boom example, that employers are going to be competing with each other to fight over the same workers to come work for their company. And by doing so, they're going to be trying to outbid each other. I'm going to offer them a bonus for working for me, or they're going to get more generous health care, or saying that like it's a bad thing, right? Or I'm going to increase their hourly wage by 50%. And so if all employers are doing this, then that's going to bid up the price of labor, which is going to be a major input into production. And so if we increase the price of an input, then we're decreasing the aggregate supply curve from SRAS0 to SRAS1, which is going to shift our equilibrium level of output back to Y0, and also increase our level of aggregate price level. So both of these impacts, an increase in aggregate demand and a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, are going to be inflationary, and the impacts on aggregate output are going to counteract each other. So in the end, what we're left with is just inflation. So from this perspective, since there's always going to be that pressure that's pushing back and shifting the equilibrium to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve back to, at maximum, the aggregate supply curve, when we see these increases in aggregate demand, we're not seeing any changes so no increase, no decrease in the equilibrium level of unemployment, but we are seeing sustained increase in the price level, which is why we see here that unemployment rate is fixed at that full employment at our natural level of unemployment. And when we increase the aggregate demand, then we're just leading to an increase in inflation. Now, it's important to note that the Keynesian perspective here, or you can be a Keynesian economist and still recognize that this is possible with increases in aggregate demand in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. It just means that it's only going to be possible when short-run aggregate supply is in its steep part, which is near the long-run aggregate supply curve. And the question then is, when is our economy at full employment and when is it not at full employment? We'll discuss that in a little bit more when thinking about the differences between these two perspectives. So to summarize the differences in these two perspectives, which are embedded in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we can think of Keynesian economics as being more oriented towards short-term equilibrium, and neoclassical economics is only being focused on really the long term. That part of the need for the Keynesian perspective was that in the neoclassical perspective, it's impossible to have a long-lasting, stable general glut. That eventually, because the purchasing power to buy goods was spent into existence by the production of those goods, eventually those goods will be bought, and it's impossible to have a permanent stock or permanent surplus of inventories on the shelves of all producers. Keynesian economics said, look, first of all, we're seeing these general gluts occur over a long period of time. They may not be permanent, but timing matters. That the longer a recession lasts, the more people are going to suffer from joblessness, the more they're going to suffer from economic uncertainty, and that we have tools at our disposal to increase the state of our economy, to improve the state of our economy in the short run. And so part of the reason, I guess a large reason for why neoclassicists believe that general gluts, recessions were impossible in the long run, is that wages and prices are thought of in their model as being flexible. That if there's a decrease in demand for goods and services, that'll be fine. The employers will just be willing to pay lower wages, and the workers who are willing to accept those lower wages still have jobs. The other ones choose to drop out of the labor market, and they're making rational, informed choices based on their outside options and the value of leisure time. Keynesian perspective realizes that wages are sticky, and that due to unions, due to implicit contracts and efficiency wages, just because there's a decrease in demand for a good which a firm produces doesn't mean that they're going to be able to just drop their wages and decrease employment in that way, that wages may stay high and there may be involuntary unemployment to compete for those wages. And then we have joblessness, which has sends ripples throughout the economy. And so in the neoclassical perspective, in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, aggregate supply is what's going to be responsible for economic output, whereas in the Keynesian perspective, related to, remember here our discussion of the Great Depression, World War II, aggregate demand is really what's going to drive short-run equilibrium. And really that's what we saw in the Keynesian cross model as well, right? Not a big shock that the Keynesian perspective aligns with the Keynesian cross model, but we thought of that model as predicting where short-run equilibrium would be based on aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure, and aggregate supply wasn't even in that model. So in the neoclassical perspective of the aggregate supply framework of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, they think of aggregate supply as being vertical, as not depending on prices, but on productive capacity. And the Keynesians think of short-run aggregate supply as being upward sloping, and there existing a long-run supply, which is more similar to the aggregate supply in the neoclassical framework. And the neoclassicists also think that the Phillips curve is vertical, that we don't actually face a choice between unemployment and inflation. We face a choice between more inflation or less inflation, whereas Keynesians, I think, recognize that the trade-off which seems to empirically exist and developed economies need to choose between. So we think that both of these perspectives, the neoclassicists and the Keynesians, agree that aggregate demand can be a useful tool for controlling inflation, that we can increase taxation as a way to cool down the economy and have there be less liquid funds chasing the same real output, which would be deflationary, and that the real, I guess, more longer lasting policy emphasis for reducing unemployment would be reforming labor markets in the neoclassical perspective, whereas once again the Keynesians here are thinking about increasing aggregate demand as a way to reduce unemployment in the business cycle and reduce cyclical unemployment. That's not to say that both of these parties don't recognize that frictional and structural unemployment are important, but just on what their emphasis of the bigger problem at any point in time in the economy is. And when we compare their perspectives on aggregate demand as a useful tool for ending a recession, the Keynesians unambiguously, as you could probably guess by now, say, yep, that's exactly what we should be doing. Whereas the neoclassicists, at their, I guess at the most they can be pushed on this when thinking about neoclassical economists in general, is that aggregate demand may have a short-run benefit in the when dealing with a recession. However, it may be counterproductive and may just lead to inflation, which is what we would expect if we were near full employment in the economy. But that's kind of a self-defeating statement, right? Because if we were near full employment GDP, we wouldn't be having a recession unless we had a massive shock to our productive capacity, which typically isn't going to happen as part of a normal business cycle, which isn't going to happen as a period of boom and bust. It's going to be due to a major setback of our productive capacity, either due to war, disease, famine, or natural disaster. And so if there's just a standard business cycle recession, even a great recession, aggregate demand should be a useful tool to increase our output without leading to major inflation because we're not near full employment GDP. And so I think if you can't tell which way I lean on this, is that Keynesian economics is a little bit more in touch with the realities of a financialized economy that we see in the 21st and mid to late 20th century. And the neoclassical economics is kind of a way to force the 17 and 1800s view of the economy to fit in the economy that we now know and love, or don't love, but recognize exists. So it's important to note that printing money or increasing government spending aren't guaranteed to lead to inflation. I know this is a perspective that is common in popular culture and in understanding of economics through discussion of politics, through the media. But when we think of I guess the framework for understanding the macroeconomy, there's multiple reasons why inflation is better thought of as a relationship between aggregate demand and aggregate supply than just as simplistically focusing on printing money or increasing government spending. That there can be an efficient use of government spending, there can be an efficient use of printed money, and there can be inefficient and unproductive uses of those, which would lead to inflation. So remember, we want to focus here on our simple definition of inflation as being too much money chasing too few of goods. And so if we're not increasing aggregate supply when we're printing money or increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, then yeah, that may be inflationary. But if what we're doing has an impact on aggregate supply, or we're nowhere near our full employment GDP, then it's not going to be inflationary. So let's just draw an exaggerated short-run aggregate supply curve here, where it gets steep when we're near the long-run aggregate supply curve. And if we print money or increase government spending, which would have a significant increase in aggregate demand, so from 80 naught to 81, then we can see significant economic growth, which would come at no impact to overall price levels in the economy. We can also think of an increase in aggregate demand as being price stabilizing, or at least maybe not deflationary, but not inflationary, if when we increase our government spending, we're spending it on a productive use, or a use which would increase our productive capacity. Now we can see that in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, if when we, so even if we're increasing aggregate demand 80 naught, say SR, AS naught, even if we're increasing our aggregate demand in the steeper part of the short run aggregate supply curve, if that same government spending, so we're increasing government spending, is so it's increasing aggregate demand because we're putting money into the hands of employees, let's say, for research and development. And if what is being produced is valuable and allows us to increase our output at a lower input, at lower cost of inputs, such as investment in solar, then we may increase our short-run aggregate supply curve as well, which would then, which could possibly come at lower prices and would definitely come at greater economic output. So not all government spending or printing of money is actually inflationary.